Much. It's really good to be here. It's really nice for me to get to come into other classes and see some familiar faces and others to meet for the first time. So thanks. I'm talking about a controversial conflict over mining, and I know in your class you're looking at issues at the community level. So I have a little bit in my talk that focuses on that. My own interest in this conflict started a few years ago when I became aware through a radio broadcast of protests in Appalachia by an environmental group, and that group called itself Mountain Justice Summer. They were protesting mountaintop removal mining and very actively seeking publicity for their stance against it. So when I heard this broadcast, I thought, well, I'd really like to present a unit on this in one of my courses. I thought that both undergrads and grad students would be really interested in a domestic conflict, in an environmental conflict, and in a conflict where people were using nonviolent protest right here in our region. Now, my own scholarship is as a cultural anthropologist, in addition to being someone who works in the conflict field. And mostly I focus on really different issues like family law and interpersonal disputes, and that kind of research I did in East Africa. And I've also done research on terrorism, both in East Africa and in the US. So that's kind of most of my professional background, but I've always taught about environmental issues also. I've always, in my courses, tried to bring them in even just a little bit, and that partly comes out of my own background. And just one little thing about where it comes from. I'm from a town in southwestern Pennsylvania called Donora, home of the champions, if you haven't heard of it. But our real claim to fame, sadly, is that our town is the first place in the United States where people died of industrial air pollution. There were steel mills there, and in the 1940s, those mills were churning along, and there came a stretch of time where the air just didn't move, and about 30 people died because of the pollution. So I've always had that growing up on my mind. That was the 1940s, but as kids, and I wasn't born then, but as kids when we grew up, we knew about that. So I've always thought about places where people feel that they're living in the midst of pollution. So it interests me as a place. So once I started to examine the protest over mountaintop mining more closely, I realized it could be a significant research project too. And as was mentioned, I'm working with Professor Frank Dukes on a book about stakeholders and in this conflict. And one of the things we're trying to understand is who considers themselves a stakeholder in the conflict over mountaintop mining. Why do, in fact, so few people see that they're stakeholders in this conflict? And I'll come back to that issue in a little bit. So the conflict itself dates back to the start of surface mining in Appalachia. That was about 30 years ago. It's become a lot more heated over the past decade. Activist groups, community leaders, industry executives, mine workers, economic developers, residents of the coalfields areas, all of these people have been involved in numerous actions and disputes over this mining practice. There have been rallies and protests over the past year in Washington, D.C. related to mountaintop mining. So in a nutshell, what are the issues at stake? Well, just in the last couple of years, it's been clear that anti-mining interests want the Obama administration to tighten regulations on surface mining or to outlaw some surface mining practices entirely, like mountaintop removal. Those groups have had some success on those issues. In response, the ad campaigns and lobbying efforts of pro-mining interests have increased. They want the same administration to relax regulations and to embrace coal more directly as part of our nation's future energy plan. So I'll tell you a little more about the conflict and its effects on communities and stakeholders in a moment. But first, let's just go over what the practice is. So this conflict is really hard to even name without acknowledging the potential for conflict in that very act of naming. So just to say what it is, you're kind of stepping into a conflict. There's sort of a more neutral way of talking about it, and that's to say surface mining. But those who are against it often call it mountaintop removal mining. Those who support it think that removal is a little too harsh a way of describing it, so they will sometimes call it mountaintop mining. MTR, MTM, you'll hear me use a variety of different things in my talk, in part because I really don't want to stand here and present all one side or all another side of the conflict. For those of you who have begun to look into it, you'll see that you can find a lot of sources that really come from one direction. So I can't say that I'll be neutral or completely balanced, but I will try to use a sort of conflict mapping approach that will allow for a variety of sides to be represented in what it is I say. So, and we could talk afterwards about whether you think I achieved that or not. It's not so easy in this conflict. So just a place where we're talking about, this is the Appalachian region. Of course, that takes its name from the Appalachian Mountains. But it's really the southern Appalachian area from kind of West Virginia on down, a little bit in Pennsylvania, where mountaintop is practiced, and also only a little bit like in Alabama, which is the bottom of the Appalachians. Coal was discovered in West Virginia in the mid-1800s, and a lot of laborers came to the region to work in the deep mines throughout Appalachia. The history is one of great expansion. So you have, after that discovery of coal, you got railroads coming in, you've got laborers coming. The other thing so there's economic expansion. The other thing that happens is that you get a lot of violence as labor and management try to sort out how they're going to work together when laborers are really doing a very, very difficult job. You get prosperity for some people over the decades. Some of the ill effects of mining generally come up early on. Bad health, bad water sometimes comes out of it. Isolation because of where the work is done is an effect for people who work in the mines. And you get over the years in-migration of laborers and out-migration as the coal industry itself has ups and downs. The demand for coal changes over time. So West Virginia and other states are still coal economies after that kind of long history, but they remain some of the poorest states in our nation. So that's important to remember, that even though they're built around coal economies and we need coal, it has not produced great wealth for most of the people on the ground involved in it. Now, what the history I've been talking about so far, starting back with that first mining of coal, starting when it was discovered in West Virginia, I'm talking about deep mining or underground mining. So that kind of traditional going in, there are a variety of ways of doing it, but going into the mountain, pulling the coal out, leaving the mountain by and large intact. Surface mining takes different forms, and it began in this region in the 1970s. The Clean Air Act changed the way that power plants burned coal and the kind of coal they were interested in. And a lot of the coal that's sort of nearer the surface became of interest. Now, why do I mention power plants? This is one of the major uses of coal in the United States, is for power, our lights, all over our region and in many other regions of the US. There are other sources of power, but coal is a significant one. So coal-fired power plants are really important to this discussion. So in the 70s, when the Clean Air Act kind of changed the rules for power plants, they sought coal that could be mined through surface mines in southern Appalachia in particular. So here's one kind of surface mining. This is called bench or contour mining. So if you imagine down here in figure 1 that that's a mountain. So the blue part is called overburden. It's soil, trees, rocks, stuff that's not coal that stands in the way of pulling the coal out. So surface mining takes that off. It's going for the coal seam, which is pink. They do the mining, pull it off, do the mining, and then post-mining they put it back in to the kind of approximate original contour. So that's one kind of surface mining that's been carried out in a lot of parts of Appalachia. The form that dismantles the top of the mountain became common in the 1990s. And in that form of mining, 500 to 1,000 feet of that part that's called overburden, the stuff that's not coal, gets blasted off, removed, pulverized. And so let me show you, and I'm going to move over there, let me show you how that's done. I'll just take you through the process. On this slide, which is a slide produced by a coal company to explain its process, if you start here, go way up and back down to the trees, that was the mountain. So you start, and it's sort of a timeline of how you do it. So it starts with trees and soil and that sort of thing. And first they cut down the trees, and then there's some bulldozing and the planting of explosives. And then the explosives blow up the top of the mountain. Now overburden, when it's a mountain, when it's packed in, is fairly compact. But when you blow it up, there's huge expansion of the soil and the material that's in there. And so you end up with, well, I'll tell you what happens, but you end up with a lot of material you've got to deal with. In the interim, there has to be clearing before you get to well, after the blasting, you identify where the coal is. So you find what's called the coal seams, and that's these that run down here. And then you have to push that overburden somewhere. So bulldozers are brought in. And this is the most controversial part of mountaintop mining, is that the overburden is pushed over the sides of the mountains into the valleys, and it becomes what's called valley fill. So it literally fills the valleys and pulls them up, not to the height of the mountain, but it pulls them up. And then, after that's done, this big machine called a drag line is constructed, literally constructed on site, because it's so big there are no roads that it could drive on, so they bring the pieces in and they construct it. And it's sort of like I don't know exactly what you call it, but it picks up, digs in and picks up the coal, loads it into dump trucks, the coal is trucked off, and then some of the material, the overburden, is brought back, and there's a kind of filling in of the areas that were dug. No attempt at all to redo the mountain. Everybody agrees you really can't possibly make it a mountain again. And then there's planting, and that's called reclamation on the other side. It's very difficult to replant the trees that had been there previously. If you know your biology, the way that planting works, you get generations of vegetation, and a lot of the forests in this part of Appalachia are old growth forests. So once you get rid of those, you got to kind of start again with things that are foreign to the area or earlier vegetation. So that's the way that it looks. The coal industry does insist that these areas can be made commercially useful. It provides flat spaces. In this part of Appalachia, where you have a lot of mountains, there's not a lot of flat area to do things like put an airport runway or a golf course or a Walmart that needs a lot of space. So some of the areas have been reclaimed for those activities. The areas, though, themselves are often rather remote. So it's not like there's a lot of people around to go golfing on them. So let me let you see what this, these are some photos of the aftermath of mountaintop removal. You can see that it can extend very far. There are areas where there are thousands of acres that have been mined in this way, and many parts not reclaimed, but still looking like that. You can see it on Google Maps if you play around with that part of southern Appalachia, eastern Kentucky, West Virginia. A lot of my discussion is about West Virginia because that's where I've spent the most time talking to people and going down to be part of, to do the research. Here, I want to point out, you see the darker area and then the lighter area. The lighter area is actually a liquid. So in the process of mining and pulling coal out and processing it, you sometimes use a fair amount of water to wash away the dirt from the coal itself, and then that dirty water becomes something you have to get rid of or contain. So there are impoundments that are holding that water, and the way it's held is the dark part is an earthen dam that's been built on the mountain to hold it up. These dams have a history sometimes of breaking or of leaking, so some of the concerns about mountaintop removal mining are that it can leave behind these kinds of situations. This is a small MTR operation, not too far from Coal River Mountain that you saw in the film. Some of the issues around this particular operation, in addition to blasting and rocks kind of flying all over the place and dust, there were some family graveyards nearby the site, and so there was a lot of concern about saving those graveyards from blasting, and also allowing some kind of access for families to get to those graves. And there are also people who live not far from this site on land that they own that's been in their family for a long time. You get just a little bit of sense of the scope when you see the kind of really big coal truck down there, and the size that we're dealing with. These are the southern coal counties of West Virginia. In red are places where there's been surface mining. So MTR plus other kinds of surface mining. And actually this is a little bit out of date. This is from 2006. In the interim, especially in the southern western area, there have been many more operations that have come up. And in fact, just to update the film a little bit, which is about 1.5 years out of date, there has been blasting and they've started mining on part of Coal River Mountain, although it's still something that people are really contesting. So who are the stakeholders? I've mentioned a number of the parties, certainly miners, certain people who live around the residents of the coalfields area, environmental justice groups, social justice groups, religious groups are involved. You heard a little bit of religious discourse in the way in which it was presented by people interviewed in the film. Environmental Protection Agency, and a whole lot more. Certainly at the bottom, the Coal Energy Lobby, and then a bunch of us who benefit from West Virginia coal as consumers. There have been many prominent people who have been involved in working against mountaintop mining, as well as a lot of local residents, local people in West Virginia and Kentucky. This is Daryl Hannah at a protest. She's been arrested. Woody Harrelson has been. James Hansen, a famous NASA scientist who's spoken out against it. On the pro-mining side, Ted Nugent's been a major proponent, supporter of mining and of miners. Kathy Mattea, Big Kenny, for anybody who follows country music, have been against it and spoken out. So this is a group of not famous, I mean, they're famous now, but they're regional activists. They're people from West Virginia. Some of the older people, there are West Virginians, longtime residents of the coalfields. Some of the younger people have come from outside the region and made their home there in order to become part of the activism. There's also activism on the other side. You see in the picture closest to me, people who are miners. You see some people have reflective tape, orange or red, on their clothes. Those are miners who wear that on their clothes when they're in the mine or in mining area for safety reasons. Their families have been very involved, although some families are split in terms of whether they support it, even if they have people doing MTR. You heard Luella, people also make choices. Some kinds of mining are good and some are not. Further on are people who are part of an organization called Citizens for Coal. There are a number of organizations that are supportive of mining. Citizens of Coal, Faces of Coal, Friends of Coal. If you drive through parts of southern West Virginia or eastern Kentucky, a lot of businesses and even homes are marked with signs, Friends of Coal, making very clear we're on the side of MTR, we're on the side of the coal companies. There is a lot of conflict in those areas. People are lining up on one side and another. It can be very tense. So, those signs have a variety of things they are communicating. What are the conflict issues? Again, trying to do just a basic sort of mapping. There's a lot of them. I won't go through all of them. Those who support MTR will say, look, mountaintop removal mining is safer than underground mining because you're sitting up on a big vehicle. You're not down in a mine that could collapse. That is absolutely true. It's also the case, as the other side would say, there are fewer miners involved in MTR. So in fact, when you move from underground mining to surface mining, you need less people, and the end result is a net loss of jobs. And that has been the case throughout Appalachia. The number of mining jobs has shrunk as surface mining increases. Other important points: mining is part of the identity and culture in West Virginia. You heard the former head of Massey Energy saying that, and a lot of people are very committed to mining and to not listening to quote-unquote outsiders whose interests might be very different. On the other side, there is a sense that MTR is destructive, that there are different paths to go in terms of energy sources, and that if you're talking about identity, maybe it's the mountains that are the identity rather than the mining. Obviously, this is a local conflict that people themselves on the ground are engaged in and sorting out. For residents, I think I've hit a number of the issues. Some of them are similar to what miners and the industry would say. Just a couple of other points. There is, by those who oppose this kind of mining, some concern that the dust produced and that the change of the landscape, the elimination of mountains, is bad for new economic expansion. For instance, the tourist industry, which is very vibrant in other parts of West Virginia, beautiful state, that this kind of mining can work against that possibility. There are specific health issues that people have raised, that again, the dust, the water have been linked to different kinds of cancers and a quality of life, a reduced quality of life. So you get, these big conflicts over energy and what's our energy future, but then when it comes down to it, the conflicts are also really right inside people's houses. Can we drink the water? Why not? Should my son go off and try to get a surface mining or not? So it's the classic conflict that really encompasses all the levels that we focus on in studying conflict. Environmental groups obviously have their own issues. They're really concerned about preservation of water, about what it means to eliminate certain mountains. They are skeptical about clean coal and are concerned about the coal industry. And these advocacy groups, some of them are national or international groups. So some of them are groups that have sent representatives who really are not from the area, but who are active in the conflict. The coal industry has pushed back on a lot of the charges of the ill effects of mining. They've contested repeatedly findings about bad water or the bad effects of coal dust or that sort of thing. And I think you heard very well articulated, again, by the industry executive in the piece that that Appalachian identity is coal mining, and that the jobs that coal mining brings are really important to the region. Where would the region be? It is the central industry. And that from their perspective, MTR is the most efficient and cheapest way of taking the coal out. They wouldn't be able to get some of the coal through underground mining or through, they say, through other means. The regulators are involved. The Environmental Protection Agency is the body that protects our rivers and streams. Any bodies of water in the United States are under the mandate of the EPA to keep them clean. You're not allowed to get rid of a lake just because you feel like it, and you're not allowed to pollute it by dumping stuff into it. On the other hand, you can get a permit if you want to do some kind of activity that might impinge on waters. And sometimes, for some permits, you go to a different regulator, the Army Corps of Engineers. And this is a complex legal battle that's been fought over a number of years. Who really has jurisdiction? It has been the case that the Army Corps has given permits for valley fills, for that stuff to be pushed over into the valley, for many, many mining operations. That's now being questioned. The Army Corps is working more closely with the EPA to do some more protection of mining. For the very first time, one permit was revoked, so it was given by the Army Corps and then pulled back. That's extremely controversial and has kind of upped the ante and made this conflict much more tense, because it's not clear which way things will go now. Will more permits be revoked? Will fewer permits be given? Although some permits have been granted in the last couple of years. And all of this stuff's in lawsuits as well as in before Congress. There have been hearings about it. Politicians are very much involved. Former Governor Joe Manchin has been involved. He's a senator now. He remains involved with the coal industry. A lot of politicians from Kentucky. And President Bush, it was under President Bush that the EPA, this move toward more permitting was, sort of got a lot of traction. The industry says, this is what we're doing. When some of the statements that the coal industry has issued suggest that they really are trying to be good stewards of natural resources. They're trying to pull the coal out because we need it. They're trying to use better technology. And I always think it's important to listen, to what the central actors are saying, to look at their statements and see if they are coming true. Here's another one, again, from the coal industry. Why do we surface mine in Central Appalachian? Certainly not because we like the public attention. We really don't enjoy the struggles with regulatory agencies, the years of permitting delays, and the seemingly endless litigation. The fundamental answer is that coal is surface mined because that's the method necessary to recover the resource. They really say that you can't do it in another way that's going to be financially viable. You just sink a ton of money into it. And certainly there are many other voices that are opposed to that industry perspective that suggests that there have been, sort of irreparable change to the environment of the region as a result of surface mining. Some of the battles have hinged on the science that's used to determine whether some of the activities are polluting or not. So, you know, there'll be a valley fill, and people will say, geez, after that valley fill, I live way over here, down further in the valley, but my water seems to have gotten bad after that. So, you know, how do you deal with that? Well, one of the things they found was that the agency that is supposed to respond to those claims by citizens, the West Virginia Department of the Environment, so sometimes they would drag their feet in checking into it. You know, like all state agencies, they don't have a lot of cash around, right? So sometimes they wouldn't, you know, jump in the car and go out and see. Some of them were very getting the message from politicians that maybe they shouldn't look into it so closely. And so there were ways of doing testing on water that made it less likely to determine that the problem was really coming from the coal mine. You can decide to do testing before or after a big rain and get a completely different result in terms of what the water looks like. So then what kind of test are you doing? There are lots of things you can test water for. And there's been a lot of controversy over what method you use. Do you look at the number of particles? They're moving now toward looking at what's called conductivity, how much opportunity there is for electric action in the water because there are so many chemicals and minerals in it. Big lawsuits over whether that scientific test is the best one to use. And again, the coal industry has their ideas and their scientists, and the government, the regulatory agencies, and the environmental groups have theirs. So sometimes you have 4 or 5 different opinions. So that's all being worked on. And although everyone does want to get on the same page about what kinds of tests to be used, sometimes it's hard to know. We do know that if you look overall, the kind of flattening and removal of vegetation that comes along with mountaintop mining does result in more runoff. So you get more water kind of rushing through areas that where it wasn't before. And with runoff, you get kind of sediment and that sort of thing in the water. A lot of activists, local and national activists, have moved their efforts to the federal government. They're looking for the federal government to push the states to do better regulation. The industry is countering those efforts. I mentioned at the outset that there were different protests in Washington, D.C. At congressional hearings. You can get representatives of both sides. It's quite a hot conflict right now and likely to continue as such. I want to just say a little bit about at the community level. You know, that fight, the activists may have taken it up to the federal level, but it remains a hot conflict at the community level. Oh, before I get there, one more thing. One of the reasons the activists have taken it to the national level is that they want people like you to hear about it. So one of the strategies is to get more stakeholders involved. To say, you know, we are sitting here under, you know, electric lights because this kind of mining is going on. Now, both sides would like you to know about it, right? Because people who are pro-MTR want to say your life would be different tomorrow if we stopped mining this coal this way. And the activists want to say, hey, you're sitting here, but some people are suffering because you have cheap energy that lights your classrooms. So the kinds of appeals that are being made to Congress are also being made to us so that we kind of sort out and maybe become more active one way or the other as stakeholders in a conflict that is very much regional. At the community level, I mentioned before, there's a lot of tension, even families are split. There's also been violence, there have been threats to activists. Activists themselves have carried out violence on coal company property. They've chained themselves to property. They've done a long-term tree sits that where they go up in a tree and stay for months at a time. And this, well, I guess 1 month, a little over 1 month was an important milestone this past summer. And that means that there's economic loss on the part of the coal company. Violence broke out at a meeting, a hearing in a community where there was to be a discussion of the way forward. It was sort of an opportunity for community residents to express their views about a permit that was possibly going to be granted. And that led, that violence, where activists eventually were told by security guards, you better leave because we can't protect you. And a bunch of activists took off. You can see it on YouTube. It's very, very interesting and disturbing. That threat of violence led to a mediation by Joe Manchin, who was then the governor of West Virginia. And the head of West Virginia Council of Churches was involved. A lot of religious communities have gotten involved. And there was a big statement about, let's not have violence be part of this. And that was a couple of years back. But there has been a continuation of violence. One moment when it seemed to, the level seemed to go down was after the Upper Big Branch underground mine disaster, if you remember that from about 1.5 years ago. After all of those individuals were killed in the mine, the community was just very, very upset, and people kind of simmered down in terms of this conflict. But that has kind of come back. I just wanted to end by just showing you a little bit of, just a little film of the area, so you get a sense of what it looks like at the community level. So you've got mountains around, and the valleys go between them. And in West Virginia, it's not like a long, in this southern part of West Virginia, Kentucky, it's not a long ridge of mountains, but it's like a mountain here, and a mountain here, and a mountain here, and a mountain here. And you get valleys that pass through them. People locally call them hollows. And right along the hollow, you usually get a stream. And people usually draw their water from those streams through wells. And so you kind of get one road, your stream, and maybe a little line of homes. And that leads to the isolation in the area. And you can think about, as you do the exercise for this class, what that might mean in terms of how people's social relations are organized, and even how their access to water is kind of sculpted by where they live. So let me just play this last little piece, and you can get a sense of just what it looks like to drive around in much of the area. And it's not like you do this drive and then you go to a place and it's like a big flat vista. Like, this is what you get for miles and miles. The overall conflict, it's being fought out, as I said, in lots of different levels. Some of the decisions made at the national level may have great bearing, but usually what's happening is, even when big decisions are made at the national level, they're contested in law courts. We will be dealing with this conflict for a very long time. One thing we might think about is what role each of us might play in it, and I think you should take some time to think about that after you do this exercise, where you get to see a little bit more what people at the community level are really dealing with, and what it means for them to be part of such an intense and complicated conflict. So I'll stop there. I have a few minutes to take questions if anybody has any. Please, way in the back.
Do you know what happened with the Clean Water Restoration Act?
With the which?
Clean Water Restoration.
I think it's still around, and there's, you know, interest in it, but it certainly hasn't passed. But some people are still working on it.
I know they were bringing it.
What's that?
I think they were bringing it again last year.
It's been brought repeatedly, but then, you know, gets stopped. I don't remember there being a vote on it. You know, it's again the halls of Congress where, you know, sort of a lot of energy goes into really crafting a bill, and then it can get stuck in a committee.
Yeah, as far as the repealed permit, didn't they pretty much let the company just continue to mine even after the repealing? Because the judge said that most of the damage that would have been done is already been done, so they continued to mine even though it was repealed, so it didn't really do much.
It didn't do much except really, absolutely, in terms of the place
yeah,
itself.
Out as something that was being thought about at least.
Right.
Yeah, so it was it was more political than like practical then, I guess, right?
Yeah, for that particular instance. But then there are mines where the permits have gone forward that are getting looked at again. And so I think it was a kind of wake-up call to the industry to say some of your other permits could be pooled, and you saw a lot of industry action trying to work against that. But for that mine, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, well, and then I had one other question. Aren't they, isn't one of the things that they're